We have a number of you already online and on the call. So welcome to the Social Mobility Commission's Employer Masterclass. Today's topic is about data, what, why and how, and we're delighted to be joined by Neil Morrison of Severn Trent to also talk about this topic with you. If we could have the next slide, please. So I'm going to give a bit of an introduction in terms of data, so some of our guidance and advice, and talk through some of the things you can do in terms of what to collect, how to collect it, what might drive up your response rates. And then we're going to go into a deep dive with Neil Morrison, as I've mentioned, who's here with us today, to find out what Severn Trent have been doing. And then if you've got any questions, we'll ask you to pop those into the Q&A and we can ask Neil for a further commentary on things he's talked about, or indeed if it's something the SMC's spoken about, and then we'll provide you with some next steps and resources at the end. So just a bit of an overview. If we can ask you to remain on mute, please use the Q&A function to ask questions. There's an option to vote for questions as well if you see a question on there that you are also dying to ask. The webinar will be recorded. And then we'll also be providing you with the presentation details as well. And I think a colleague of mine will post that into the chat now as well. So the presentation that I'm about to give will actually be sent to you as well. And there are closed caption available for anyone who require it. So if I could ask for the next slide, please. So what is social mobility? So social mobility refers to the link between our starting point in life and where we end up. So it's what's the difference between our parents' occupation or income and our own, really. It's also determining that your starting point in life doesn't dictate your future. It's about ensuring your background doesn't dictate your future. So if I could, the next slide, please. Just as we talk about data, I love this quote: not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. And it's often attributed to Einstein, but it's actually William Bruce Cameron who said it. And it's just to highlight that data is not the only story and shouldn't really be used in isolation. It should really be used to drive the right behaviours in your organisation and the right decisions in your organisations. And we'll explore a bit more about what we mean about that later when we talk to Neil, but also as we go through the presentation. Next slide, please. So why should we collect socio-economic diversity data? Well, without data, you don't really know what interventions are needed and how do you prioritise the activity that you do. For instance, a lot of people will look at data through their recruitment process or their early years hiring process. And what are you doing with that data? How are you assessing what is working for you in terms of making changes to that process, and what is having an impact, and what you want to continue and what you might indeed want to stop? Many firms now collect socio-economic diversity data from their applicants, and some regulatory bodies as well. So people like the Solicitor Regulation Authority and the Chartered Accountants Authority in England and Wales request that data is being reported. So there's quite a lot of organisations who are being tasked with collecting diversity data, and in particular socio-economic background data, by their regulatory authority. And I think there's opportunities that other trade bodies or regulation authorities might start to include it as well. So if you're an organisation that don't collect and your industry doesn't currently want it, it might be something you want to get on the front foot about before you are being tasked to do it. We know that more organisations need to be looking at what data they're collecting with existing employees. Our colleagues and our friends at the Social Mobility Foundation shared with us that those organisations who are in the Social Mobility Employer Index, so those that are already talking about doing a lot of work in this space, nearly half of them are not yet asking any socio-economic background data of their existing employees. And hopefully we hope to see an increase in that in this year's submissions, which were submitted by May and results out later this year. It's also important that people consider it against all the other diversity data, and then map it across their employer's journey. So that's from entry level or even outreach level right the way through to exit, and it can give you a really detailed view of what's happening within your organisation, how comfortable people from certain backgrounds feel about staying within your organisation, and that's something obviously we'll explore as we go through this presentation. And to measure your socio-economic diversity is critical to driving the success of any interventions that you're putting in, and anything that you're interested in along this, this diversity strand. But what exactly should you ask applicants? And this is something that I know a lot of people struggle with. It's the questions we get asked the most when we're approached by employees. So if we could have the next slide, please. So prior to our work at our employer toolkits, which the very first one we launched back in February 2020, there was a very detailed question that had 4 parts within it about parental occupation, that was recommended by the Office of National Statistics, the ONS. And following our launch of the toolkit, and when a lot more organisations started to get involved in this agenda, we received feedback and again, information through the Social Mobility Employer Index that employers were finding it incredibly difficult, and they weren't actually asking the best question, which is the parental occupation question, because it was just far too long. It involved coding, it involved if you ticked this box and it drove you through to another box, etc., etc. And that was a challenge, I think, for employers to, first of all, fit it into their HR systems, but also for individuals to understand what it was asking. And so therefore it ended up with a lot of incomplete data, organisations, and many of those organisations who published their data, their socio-economic background data last year publicly, found this as well. And so we worked with academics, experts, think tanks, charities and employers to really understand what was the issue with asking this question and how could we address it. And so we actually looked at creating one key question. And so this was actually devised by academics, and it was, the question they asked themselves is, does the metric reflect what it purports to measure? So socioeconomic background, does it, can it be reasonably assumed that if somebody answers this particular question, that it might have the potential to adversely affect their educational progress and also access and progression within the workplace? And also, is the measure, which of the measures that we're asking people to take on board, are they so sensitive or intrusive that it leads to a low response rate, or that the information might be hard to recall? So obviously there, in the past, some employers have asked questions about what income did your parent have when you were a child, and a lot of people can't remember that or recall that detail, or would even know, and how do you relate it into today's money or experience? So we created this one key question, and that is backed and sponsored and endorsed by our partners. So if we could have the next slide, please. So the question is, and I say it's the simple question, and we know it's not from the feedback we get from people, that people do find it quite challenging. But what was the occupation of your main household earner when you were aged about 14? And the reason it's about 14 is it is assumed, but also the data shows that people are generally established in their career by the time their children are aged around 14. Now, someone's pointed out to me in the past that obviously you could have someone who's 14 and then 10 years later they have another child and they might end up in a different class background. But these are all very slight cases. It is, the academic research shows that parental occupation is a good proxy for parental income, and that has been linked to future attainment. So this is all driven by academic research, and there's much academic literature on this topic and the link between an individual's outcome and their parents' occupation. So if I could have the next slide, please. So the responses that you would ask to that main question, and these are all on our website, and my colleague will post into the chat the links to this, and we'll supply these with you afterwards. But these are the responses that then lead into whether someone is considered to have a professional background, an intermediary background, or a working class background. And then, as with all diversity characteristics, you can list other. So this would be people such as retired. This question doesn't apply to me. I don't know, I would prefer not to say. So that gives people to opportunity to still respond, but exclude themselves from the data. If someone has grown up in care, for instance, you could post that into your pre-notes that you suggest to people. But of course, somebody who's grown up in care and who's in a foster home has somebody as a household earner within their household. So it is a question they could, in theory, answer. Some of them could, in theory, answer. So if I could have the next slide, please. We also suggest that organisations can ask supplementary questions, but these aren't a proxy of socio-economic background. They just show advantage or disadvantage. So I think we just need to make that clear when you're collecting this data as a standalone question. It doesn't necessarily show someone's socio-economic background. So the type of school that they went to, so whether it's a selective school, independent state school, or if they were, if they choose, for instance, to say, prefer not to say, that what we're actually looking for there is for people who have who had an education in an independent or a private school, because just 7.5% of people attend independent schools, but research by the SMC and others show that those in senior professions, in senior roles within professional professions, that figure is much higher. So the leaders in those organisations have more than likely have been, I think in one of them in creative industries, it's 60% of senior leaders attended a private school. And then when you look at if questions around for your outreach, for instance, or early in careers programs, you might want to ask the question around free school meals. And this shows a measure, it's a measure of extreme disadvantage. Around 15% of students are eligible for free school meals. But of course, a lot of people may not choose to disclose this for various reasons. So do be kind of aware that it's quite a sensitive question to be asking people. So really explain what you're going to do with that data and how you're going to measure it. And a fourth question that could be a question you ask for your graduate hires. And I know from the Solicitors Regulation Authority, they ask it because predominantly you need a law degree to access the law profession. Did either of your parents attend university and gain a degree by the time you were 16th and 17th? Now, a lot of people do talk about being first in family, but actually there's something like 68% of the current graduate people who've left university aged around 25, 68% of them are first in family. So it's whilst it's a great thing to know and it can help you understand people who are entering your graduate scheme and really put that support and that framework around them, it's not a measure of socioeconomic background. So if we could have the next slide, please. So a lot of people talk about driving up response rates, and so these are just a few ideas that we've gleaned from employers we've worked with, from academics who talk about gathering research, and also considering other data diversity questions that people are asked and within a workplace, and what could you do to sort of drive up those response rates. And so what's really important is to showcase to people why you're collecting this data. So you're collecting it for a reason, and the reason is you want a more socio-diverse and inclusive workplace. And I think that's really important to frame all of the work you're doing in terms of collecting data around that. You know, people are more likely to engage with this if they understand that it's part of a diversity strategy. You know, inviting people to colleagues to share their stories themselves and why they're sharing their data and they feel comfortable sharing their data really help, especially if they are line managers or managers, really help people understand the importance of the data. And you can obviously, with most diversity data, it's compulsive. It's not compulsory. So you can make surveys non-compulsory to start off with, but you could also try and encourage people and drive up the response rate once you've been doing it for a number of years to make it compulsory to actually complete the survey. But if people are provided with an option of prefer not to say, that still tells you something, and we'll explore that a bit later on with Neil as well. Words matter. So some people have said things like disclose sounds very negative. It sounds like it's something you disclose CCJs, you disclose speaking, convictions, etc., etc., and it sounds very formal. It doesn't sound very positive. So maybe setting a conversation in your organization about how you're asking people to share their data, but they're sharing that data with a very small group of people, and it will be anonymized and used in that form to drive decisions within your organizations. And just think of innovative ways to catch the attention of colleagues. The BBC have told us in the past they've set targets for people to get targets in terms of response rates, which really captured the imagination of some of their line managers in terms of thinking about innovative ways to ensure that people felt comfortable sharing their data, but then also actually going on and doing it, because most of it involves the process of going into the HR system and logging that information. And the HMRC in the past have told us that they put it on their email signatures for internal emails. Don't forget to supply your diversity data within a campaign window. And so there's lots of ways you can really think about others within the organisation to help you drive out responsibilities. And of course, there is the issue of confidentiality and GDPR. So just be very clear when you're collecting any data of who gets to see it, how it'll be stored, how it'll be used. And explain that the data is not there for you to discriminate against any particular person or look at somebody in any individual light. It is always aggregated, and it's not going to be made a decision on the individual, and particularly early in careers, because it's the first time someone's entered the workforce and is providing this sort of level of private data. So really assure them in terms of how it will be used. So if we go to the next slide, please. So there's obviously an option for organisations who have the capacity to do so to think about benchmarking, because it can be a really impartial, data-driven way of understanding how your workforce compares either to the national workforce, which is the figures that you'll see on the slide there, but we've also got some industry workforce as well. So that's quite interesting in terms of some organisations are looking at, compared to their industry, how do they perform as well. And so it should also it'll give you understanding of what differences there may be, and then you can investigate on how could you drive up change, and in terms of what measures, what are the barriers that are that possibly exist that are stopping people from different backgrounds either accessing your organisation or progressing in your organisation. And there I just repeat on the right hand side there those figures in terms of what the national benchmarks are for those people who've attended independent fee-paying schools, people at state-funded schools who are eligible for free school meals, and those graduates who are first in family to attend. And I think those can definitely tell you a story when you look at them within the framework that we've previously talked about. So if we go to the next slide, please. So it's really important that when you get the data, you actually analyse it. So it's not just about collecting the data, it's what do you do with it? Where can you publish it? So, I mean, it's a great thing to obviously showcase your board to your board. So if you can review the proportion of applicants from each group, and then you can understand, you know, where have you got gaps? Where do you think you need a better outreach program, for instance, if it's for early in years, you know, or experienced hires. Where could you advertise your roles that aren't being seen or are being seen by different people? You could consider the data along the employee lifestyle, and we'll talk a bit more about this with Neil in terms of performance and progression, and also senior leadership and executive roles. But also, as I mentioned earlier, people who are exiting. I don't know if any of you do leavers surveys, but you could ascertain who's leaving, because if people don't feel comfortable in your organization and they're leaving because they don't feel comfortable in your organization, that indeed also shows you there's an issue there that you need to look at. And for leading best practice, it's great that lots of organizations obviously publish their data internally, but more and more are starting to publish it externally with their gender and their ethnicity data that they publish. And also, if you are a large organization and you have a lot of clients or customers, or you have people that you work with along your supply chain, you could start talking to them about collecting this workforce data and helping them to get on this journey as well. So I think my colleague has been posting in the chat some links to best practice and case studies as well, so please do have a look at those. So if I could have the next slide, please. Brilliant. So that's the end of me giving you a whistle-stop tour on data. I'm delighted that we're joined today by Neil Morrison, who is the Director of Human Resources at Severn Trent PLC. So Neil joined Severn Trent around 5 years ago as the Director of Human Resources, having a career in HR management since 1996, working in a variety of HR roles within FTSE 100 companies, including Rentokil, Initial and Penguin Random House, so all organisations that we've heard of. So Neil leads the internal and external communications and marketing teams, in addition to his remit under HR, and sits on the executive board. So welcome, Neil. I'm just going to mention who Severn Trent are as well. So they're one of Britain's largest water companies, employing 7,000 staff and impacting on the lives of 8 million customers that they supply across the Midlands. And Neil was telling us earlier, before you all joined, that they're sponsoring or involved in the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham this year. So look out for that when you're watching coverage on the BBC. Look out for Severn Trent. A third of their footprint is deemed in the social mobility cold spots, and they regularly feature high up on the social mobility employee top 75 list. So welcome, Neil.
Thank you very much. That was a very nice introduction.
Thank you for joining us. I think my first question, I think the title of the masterclass is what, why and how, but I'm actually going to start with why, I think, because why did you get started collecting socio-economic background data on your workforce? But also, how did you start?
Yeah, so you mentioned the creative industries, and I was actually in the creative industries before I moved to Severn Trent. And when I came here, it felt like we were an organisation that was incredibly well placed to be able to influence some of the lives of the people in our community. And as you say, you know, we're a regional business. And so I wanted to understand exactly what was going on in our communities, who the people were, how many of the social mobility cold spots existed, and whether we were genuinely reflective of the communities we were serving in our workforce. Now, I'm sure, like many people, when you start to say to your people who run your HR systems, oh, we want to capture this data, or we want to capture that data, you get a lot of sighs and scratching of heads and kind of questions. So in order to get a quick start, what we started to do was look at postcode data. We know it's not 100% accurate, and we knew it was quite a crude measure, but we could look at kind of what was the breakdown of our communities and how many of the people that were working for us came from some of those social mobility cold spots or were living in them or in and around, to give us a fast start, if you like, whilst we did the piece in the background of starting to build more accurate data and more accurate profile that we knew would help us kind of going forward.
Brilliant, thank you. And did some of that kind of, I guess, inform future strategy as well? So, you know, what questions do you ask and what does it show you?
Yeah, so we now ask the 4 questions that you've outlined earlier. So that's all part of our process now. It's all built into our system. We capture that at the point of hire, and we're starting to increasingly capture that for people later on in the organisation, and trying to use that to look at various other aspects of data that we capture within the organisation. So, for example, tenure, performance, pay progression, career progression, attrition, engagement, all of these things. So the more that we can capture on that, then we can overlay it and start to understand exactly what's going on and where those friction points might be in terms of the employee life cycle, where we might start to see either a positive effect or conversely areas where there's a bit of friction and we need to think about how we might smooth that down and how we might make things better for employees.
Brilliant. And I'm assuming it also helps you show commercial benefit. I think when we spoke before, you said that part of the reason for collecting was to show the commercial benefit. Can you explain that a bit more and how you've been able to do that with the data you collect?
Yes, so ultimately, I mean, this is the thing about inclusion, isn't it? It's the thing about diversity in its broadest sense. It's about getting the best people into the organisation. It's about performance. You know, we are, like many organisations, you know, we are in business to be commercially successful. And so what we wanted to see was actually, you know, through attracting diversity, and in this case, socio-economic diversity, can we see a real link to performance within the workforce? And so by looking, for example, at performance review data and overlaying that and saying, so managers independently, how are they rating the performance of people who come from socio-economic cold spots or lower socio-economic backgrounds? And what we started to see was broadly, I mean, it is a bit of a broad sweep, but generally better performance, better progression, longer tenure, and equal and sometimes higher engagement. That one does tend to be dependent on parts of the organisation you work in. So it allowed us to be able to go back and go, well, hang on a sec, this is a bit of a no-brainer, because if we put our attraction strategies into areas where we know that there are issues around social mobility, not only are we helping communities that we serve, not only are we doing the right thing for the areas that we operate in, but also we're attracting a hugely kind of high-performing, highly engaged, loyal and committed workforce that then add to driving the performance in the organisation.
Brilliant. And I guess with, I mean, you know, there's a lot of talk about the Great Resignation. So that loyalty and that tension and that engagement really helps you think a lot further ahead than thinking, you know, we might lose really good staff in this period of that Great Resignation.
Yeah, I really dislike that phrase, because I don't think it's actually what's going on. But I think that we'll see in time how that plays out. But I think it's right. And I remember someone saying to me early in my career, you know, the issue isn't just about making the employee say, oh, I'm not going to listen to another job offer, I'm not going to look. It's about their family and friends and the community around them saying, well, why would you want to leave Severn Trent? Because they've done, you know, brilliant things by you. You've invested in your development. They've invested in your skills. You know, they took you on as an apprentice and you're now a team manager. So it is about creating that loyalty from beginning to end in the experience, and making sure that you know, as much as possible, anyone can come in and progress to the best of their ability and the best of their competence within the organisation, regardless of their background.
Yeah, brilliant. I love that, actually. I don't think I'd ever thought about the fact that you are also influenced by people around you, as well as your own decision in terms of jobs and careers that you take. Fantastic. Many people, Neil, on this call will have colleagues who are reluctant to share their data. I'm sure you've also had colleagues who talk about being nervous about sharing diversity data. So what's your experience been of this? Is it different depending on those entering the organisation or those already in the organisation? What have you found?
Yes, so I mean, I've been in this world for close to 30 years, and I think, you know, on the whole of sort of diversity monitoring, we've seen questions change and adapt, and we start to ask different things and different people feel more comfortable. And it's probably true that I think the questions around socio-economic diversity are probably less familiar for lots of people. But we do see at the senior end, we see lots of people who are really quite proud of their backgrounds, and they're proud to say, you know, this is where I came from and this is where I am now. On our new talent schemes at our entry level, we see less of concern about people talking about their background and upbringing. And actually, that might just be because it's more recent, so they probably can remember it. I think where we see more hesitancy is perhaps in the kind of middle part of the organisation in terms of people's careers, and whether that's driven either by a why do you need to know, I don't see why it's important, or a fear of, well, you know, are you going to judge me either way, either because I went to private school, so you're suddenly going to say, well, you're not going to get a promotion, or because, you know, my dad was a lawyer or a barrister, that suddenly that's going to be used against me, or conversely, oh, you're not going to give me the opportunity because you think that I maybe haven't got the educational background that's in there. So it's that middle part that's the real, you know, target for us in terms of making them feel more comfortable about self-disclosure. Or alternatively, as I think we touched on earlier, saying, you know, I don't want to disclose, rather than just, you know, no data, which at least tells you something about comfort and that inclusion.
Yeah, and that I guess then helps you understand what the challenge is and how you can overcome that challenge.
Exactly. And so, you know, is it an awareness? Is it, oh, the HR system's too hard to you know, I don't understand the questions, or is it actually, I understand what you're asking me, but I'm reluctant to do it because I think that you might do something with it. And so that's when we've really got to help tell people this is all aggregated up, right? We don't look at it at an individual level. We use it to understand trends, and we use it to be able to identify, as I say, are there friction points in the system that we need to try and help smooth out, or alternatively, are there opportunities in the system that we didn't know were there because we're seeing people progress quicker? And I think, you know, there's a few kind of ways in which we do that. So there's visible role models, and making sure that we get people who are willing to talk in the same way that we would about LGBTQ plus, or, you know, ethnicity. There's people sharing their stories, and there's also just an education part, working with our unions, working with colleague groups to help them to understand why we ask, why it's important, and how it helps us to better support our communities and our workforce.
Brilliant, excellent. I think that's a key point, really, is the where you mentioned about role models and how they helped you encourage others to, you know, by showcasing those role models helps encourage others to share their data. Having worked in HR myself, I know that is crucial. How else have you done it beyond role models?
Yeah, so I mean, some of it is about, as I say, that kind of sense of understanding of why it's important and why we use it. And it's not about kind of being woke or trying to overnet engineer an organization. It's about trying to understand people's experience and being able to adapt that, but also understanding kind of some of the performance data and how that relates. And I think when you can put it into that context, people feel more comfortable about it. Bizarrely, when it feels like it's a a slightly kind of social engineering sort of, that's when you tend to get the resistance, both from people who, are inside a group and those people who are outside of a group, whichever group it is, because there's a sense of, well, that I don't like that sense. I want to feel that I'm operating in a meritocracy. But of course, the only way you're operating in a meritocracy is being able to measure it. And so, that's probably one of the key kind of arguments to try and get across, I think.
Brilliant. And how about how have your CEO and executive team supported you?
Yeah, so I think to be honest, I mean, we have a lot of people in the executive team who've grown up in the communities that we serve and who've come from backgrounds and maybe have probably developed some of that polish over time rather than necessarily being born with it. And so there's a lot of support amongst our exec and our board to kind of champion this issue. But I think sometimes it's about them telling their story, because there can be a perception that, if you're an executive in FTSE 100, you must have gone to private school and you must have gone to a Russell Group university, and your parents must have also have been in that world. And hand up, none of the above is correct for myself or many of my colleagues. So talking about our backgrounds, our experiences, and how we got to where we are, I think can sometimes break down some of those barriers a little bit.
Brilliant, excellent. I'm assuming that also helps with the sticky middle that we talk about as well, because they can see that that's possible within your organisation.
I think it does help, but I think it perhaps helps more, if I'm totally honest, at the entry level as well. Wow. There's a bit more trust there, I think, just around kind of aspiration maybe. At that stage, but it definitely does. It helps across all levels in the organisation, sure.
Brilliant. So one final question from me before I open it up to the questions in the Q&A. So if you've got a burning question for Neil or myself, do put that in the Q&A. There's often debate about setting organisational D&I targets and ensuring that it's leading to the right behaviour. Do you set targets, and what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so targets and indexes, isn't it, is kind of a bit of a problem, both of them together. I think, ultimately we do have targets because we want to understand how we're progressing and what we're tracking towards, but it's not what we aim for. It's not the thing itself. It is a kind of milestones more than, if you like, kind of goals to say, have we progressed at the rate that we want to go at? And that's similar to, as I say, the kind of indices and things like this, whether it's Hampton-Alexander or the Social Mobility Index or things like that. Those are outcomes. They're not things that you should aim for just in themselves. And I think it's important that we look at various measurements across the board rather than just a percentage of workforce. So it's kind of, what does that look like at entry level? What does it look like experienced hire in when people are coming in with 3 or 4 years experience? What does it look like at executive level? What's the makeup of the board? So all of those things are important rather than just a sort of binary target. And I think measurement is good. Targets can drive the wrong behaviours unless you're careful.
Yeah, brilliant. That's great. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to look at some of the questions that we've had come through. So if you bear with me. So in the work, one of our attendees says, in the work we are doing at our organisation, that individuals are more likely to answer other social mobility questions, like whether they had free school meals or went to a state school, but less likely to answer what your parent did at 14 question. Do you have any insights on that? Is it reflective in other organisations you work with? And finally, anything we can do to encourage the completion of that question, please? Now, I'm going to ask you first, and then I'm going to talk about some of the organisations that we work with and what they say.
Yes, so I mean, we see broadly similar response across the questions, if I'm totally honest. So we don't say, I do think there is something about lots of people later on not actually knowing what their parents were kind of doing and where that would sit. And so that can be one of the reasons. So I think maybe giving examples or kind of clearer guides about the kind of things, but it's difficult, as you mentioned earlier, because it does get very personal, doesn't it? And it gets very, it's individual judgment around where that sits. But certainly we don't see a huge difference across the questions.
No, brilliant. It's interesting. I don't know of many others that have said they do. They did when it was the old 4-part, and that was part of the challenge and why it was simplified. I think a lot of organisations say they need a lot of background work in terms of conversations with people or with groups as to start encouraging certain groups of employees to feel comfortable to share that data. Having spoken to the Bridge Group in the past, they've said that actually they've done some research and it's shown that people don't find it more intrusive question than being asked about their religion or being asked about their sexual orientation. It's just that it's more common to have been asked that because of the 2010 Equality Act for the last 12 years, and not so much socio-economic diversity. So I think there's a thing around making sure that people understand why you're collecting it. I think there's always going to be, what's the relevance of my parents? So there's a piece around some employers talk about some of the research that shows that, that this where it's a proxy that I talked about earlier, that it does define your future. And a lot of people have never really considered that there may have been barriers to them until you start pointing out there's a barrier to you. And I think that's true of quite a few diverse, there could be barriers in place that you've just not noticed, or you've just assumed you just didn't get that role, but didn't realize that actually you've not been tested on your merit or your talents or whatever. So hopefully that has responded to that question. So another question is from Andrew Foster, says, do organisations like Severn Trent or others use initial data as a baseline? And if employee background doesn't look diverse enough, then look to see change, which can be tracked through data collection? And what types of timescales are involved if this is the case? So Neil?
Yeah, so I mean, that's broadly what we were trying to do with the postcode data very early on, was establish a baseline. We knew it wasn't 100% accurate, and we know that within a single postcode you can have areas of social mobility and areas of poor social mobility, and because of the nature of the localization of that. So we wanted to use it as a baseline to get ourselves going, to get ourselves moving, and at least say, well, at least we've got something, rather than saying until you've got 60, 70, 80% of the data, you can't do anything. In terms of the time period, I mean, I've been here 5 years and we're still on the journey as we go now, but as we are on, gender and ethnicity, and as we are on, LGBTQ plus, for example. So I don't think you ever kind of reach an end goal when you say it's sorted, because each year is about tweaking and improving and changing and seeing different trends. But it is definitely a multi-year piece of work rather than a kind of few months. And so my personal advice would be, use what you can get to start with. Don't wait and put it off until the data's there, to at least start the conversation and start to understand what your workforce looks like. Yeah, absolutely. And we've heard that from other organisations that, they've got a goal of having, I don't know, something like 70%, for want of a better word, even though I've said don't use disclosure rates, that, they've still, before they've got to that, they're still very happy to publish internally, some of those gaps, and to see what those gaps looks like. Someone has asked, Asif Butt has asked, said, thank you, Neil. And what measures have you implemented after analysing your organisation's data? Yes, so we do a lot at the point of hire, if I'm totally honest. So we look at, whether it's the university breakdown that people are coming into, whether it's the type of schools that we're going in terms of outreach to people, whether it's where we're placing adverts or whether we need to do particular kind of upskilling programs. So one of the things, for example, we're doing at the moment is working in a lot of areas of poor social mobility within the region to work on employability programs, because what we found was it was often some of the skills in terms of interviewing, CV prep that were holding people back. But also things like being very, very clear up front about the interview questions we ask. So if you go onto our website and you go through links, you'll find that we specify the kind of questions that you're going to be asked at interview, because the coaching that you can get if you come from maybe a family who are experienced in that process, and they'll say, oh, they're going to ask you a bunch of competency-based questions. So think about a time when you did this or when you showed that. If you don't have that, you come in and you can sit there and go, well, I didn't even know I was going to get a question like that. So lots of those small tweaks that you can start to make to just try and smooth the entry level. When people are in the organisation, actually, as I've said earlier, we don't see much friction. In fact, the opposite. We see a lot of positive progress. And so we've had to do less there. But there have been conversations with, the board and the executive committee about how unintentionally the things that they might say informally might be, kind of microaggressions, if you like. And so just that raising that awareness of the kind of things that might be impactful on someone who perhaps didn't have the same background or confidence as some of the other people.
Yeah, definitely. I'm assuming that's also things like the informal chats, like where did you go skiing this year?
That's exactly the one because that's exactly the one that was in my mind was, where are you going skiing? Right, it's a ridiculous question. I haven't been skiing for, I don't know, 35 years or something like that. So
I was once asked what did I read at university, which threw me completely, because I was like, well, everything that was in front of me. So yeah, brilliant. I think we've got time for a couple of more questions. So how do your senior leaders, how does Severn Trent use this data to improve the employee experience and build an inclusive culture? What are the challenges faced by people from low socio-economic backgrounds? Oh, it's disappeared. And how can the leadership team best evolve that culture to make it more inclusive? There's quite a few in there.
Yeah. So I think what one of the things that I think is really important is aspiration, and so this is where we do see a difference. So we run a program internally called Get That Job, which is about helping people in terms of confidence and raising aspiration in order to apply for promotion. Because if you have a perception that's not for people like me, or in order to get to that level, or in order to be in the senior management team or the executive committee or whatever it is, you've got to come from this background. Then what we see, and this isn't just the case with socioeconomic diversity, it can also be ethnic diversity and gender to a certain extent. People self-deselect before they've even gone into the process. And so kind of programs that look at confidence, that look at aspiration, that look at mapping, that look at preparation for progression is really, really important. Because what we don't want to do is have lots of people joining our organisation, whether that's entry-level positions or new talent programs, and then just staying at that level. And when we're then hiring, we end up bringing people externally in from different backgrounds. So that's really important. As I said earlier, we measure it in terms of performance assessment, pay progression, engagement, to try and make sure that those challenges are dealt with. And that's not just, again, in terms of socioeconomic diversity, that's ethnicity and gender as well, and disability. So trying to identify if there are any concerns. The good news is that doesn't seem to be systemic across the organization. The bad news is you do get pockets of it within teams. And so that's more about working with the managers, working with the directorates and coaching those areas. And it's just a constant kind of year-round, day in, day out, sort of slowly, if you like, sanding away any friction, any kind of challenges within the organization to make sure that as much as possible, people feel confident and competent to progress as far as they want to in their careers. And so I guess, you know, that's about access to training, it's about access to academic qualifications, as much as it's about feeling that confidence in the workplace to be able to be myself.
Yeah, brilliant. I love that answer. Thank you very much. I think it's almost answered the final question I was going to ask, because you did talk about how hiring senior leaders, and actually you're trying to grow them from within. But it says, how do you combat accusations or tokenism when trying to hire senior leaders from diverse backgrounds?
Yeah, I mean, it's great, isn't it? My CEO is a female, and she's probably had the articulation of tokenism throughout her career. You know, she's hugely talented and she's hugely successful, and I think, you know, we want the best. Let me flip it round, you know, on its head and say, what are the chances that all the best people are going to be white, middle-aged, middle-class men? You know, it's statistically unlikely, and so I do hear and I recognise those accusations of tokenism, and we probably, you know, come up against it. I talk about it in terms of visible role models, and I would never hire someone because of their background over their capability, but I would hire someone because they were the most capable person by looking into the majority of backgrounds that I can access, because that gives me the best talent pool. But I hear it, right? It's not going to stop for a while.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. I think that's a great answer as well. So hopefully lots of people can take that answer back to their organisations. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, really. So thank you, Neil, for being so honest and telling us all about your experience within Severn Trent. We've just got a final slide to show in terms of some of the resources people can have a look at. And then for those of you we've not been able to answer your questions, we'll have a look at those, and if possible, get some responses directly to you after. If they're not anonymous, if they're anonymous, we'll have no idea of who sent them, but others will respond via email. So there's just some further resources that you can use. We have our employer toolkits. We've got specific ones for financial, professional services and creative industries, but we've got this one that's the very first one that we ever did, which is cross-industry. And there's lots of information about data, but also on hiring, recruitment, outreach, etc. And those were designed with employers currently doing a lot of work in this space, and that best practice that we talked about earlier. So it's not just guidance from the SMC, it's actually what has been working in organisations, and what those organisations are doing. In order to have any sort of conversation with people about data, you need to start talking about why you're collecting data. We've got a great resource called Let's Talk About Class that we presented a masterclass more recently on, so do go back and visit that if that is of interest to you. We've also, last week, we published our State of the Nation report. When we share the link to the slides and the video presentation to this, we'll also share a short video and a link to the State of Nation that you can watch. It's a 4-minute video in terms of our new chair and our new deputy talking about their forward planning and fresh approach to social mobility. And if you're an organisation that's just starting out and you're doing pockets of please do take our maturity assessment. It's a 15 question assessment, and it will give you some guidance of where on our site to find some resources that can help you pick up different activity if you want to. But all our contact details are on there. So it just remains for me to say thank you to everyone for joining. But our thanks, indeed the audience's thanks as well, to Neil for bringing that perspective from Severn Trent for us. So thank you for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.